Good evening, everyone. We're live with Royal Falcon Press presenting the podcast Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. And I'm here with Emmy-nominated filmmaker, documentary videographer and filmmaker, Jafar Falahi. Jafar and his team have been nominated for Outstanding Investigative Documentary and Best Documentary at the 43rd Annual News and Documentary Emmys next week in New York City. The film is called The Line and is featured on Apple TV Plus if anyone wants to check it out. Here's the IMDb blurb for it. In covert modern warfare, the line between right and wrong has been blurred. This docuseries examines the moral ambiguities of war as embodied by the 2018 case in which a U.S. Navy SEAL platoon accused its chief, Eddie Gallagher, of war crimes. Welcome to the show, Jafar. Do you want to just open up by sharing a couple of comments about this documentary, how you came to be involved in it, and what it's about?
Yeah, so I've been working with under a producer named Colby Goddard and a director called directors Mike and Jeff Zimbalist for a number of years now. So I've done the cinematography for a number of their films over the years, and so this one just happened to. This one we filmed Eddie down in his house in Florida, him and his wife, and then we went and filmed with some of the other members of his platoon in Georgia and another place. And so yeah, it's just a story of his platoon accusing him of killing a young war prisoner. There was a young Iraqi kid, I think, or no, Afghan kid, who I think it was in Kabul, who they had captured, and they accused him of killing the kid. And also there was some other stuff that he did that they felt were war crimes. So it's a story about that and the struggle between his platoon and himself. And I believe that Trump pardoned him at one point. I'm not sure if it was exactly what the technically what Trump did, but Trump was involved at one point in the case. And I think it's a 4-part series, and it's pretty good. So you should check it out.
Well, we're honored to have you here, and it does indeed sound like an interesting one. And we are continuing our series on investigating, in particular, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the articles associated with that, which define and describe a minimum standard of human behavior and the commitment of the nations of this world to honor and defend, protect human rights everywhere. So certainly a topic that you're, very much interested in and have been involved in with for several years. When we discussed this over the last 2 shows, we introduced it with a video that kind of highlighted the history of human rights, broadly speaking, going, back thousands of years to the various efforts at moving towards a standard. We then dove specifically into the Human Rights Declaration in 1948. Welcome, Daniel. And we then, we'll just let Daniel get situated here. We then, looked specifically at how the Declaration of Human Rights might indeed be the fulfillment of prophecy in Matthew 25 about the return of the Son of Man to his throne of glory and how he would judge the world. And how in Matthew there's a statement about we will be judged according to the judgment we mete out. And, we presented a hypothesis that sort of ties this together. We then began to look at the specific human rights, and we did that on the last show. And tonight we're going to wrap up that series with looking at individual human rights. I'm going to go ahead and add Daniel now, who's just joined us from British Columbia. Daniel, I don't know if you caught, but Jafar and his team have just been nominated for an Emmy Award for a documentary film or docuseries that he worked on. And you'll see the little quote there about what it's about. So this will be next week in New York City. At the Emmys, we'll find out if Jafar and his team won in either category for Outstanding Investigative Documentary, and Best Documentary. So we're honored to have him here, and of course yourself as the CEO and founder of Planksip, which is no slouch in its own right in terms of bringing issues and topics to the awareness of the public. So we've just summarized where we've been the last few shows. Tonight is kind of going to be the wrap-up show, the last show where we dive specifically into the Declaration of Human Rights, at least for now. And what we want to do is go through 2 or 3 of them. I've picked article number 12. Jafar has picked article number 17. Daniel, if you have one that you'd like to cover after that, we can do that as well. I'm going to go ahead and show article number 12 to jump right into it. So article number 12 of the 30 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads, "No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks." Now, this is a real interesting one in light of developments in the last several decades, and in particular in the last few years, because what used to be private or semi-private has become much more public. What used to be perhaps a little bit difficult to track, monitor, and manage on a mass scale has become easier to monitor, manage on a mass scale. And certain nations have invested more into the ability to track, monitor, and manage conversations, opinions, viewpoints. And of course, this is because of the rise of technology, interconnectivity, digital communications, and of course, the rise of social media networks, in which people's opinions in the marketplace of ideas can become very public, in which even semi-private conversations can become public. You can have groups on Facebook that are public or private, but I think all of us know that, or may have even experienced that, you publish something even in a private group, and you might get a little pop-up fact checker to try to provide an alternate opinion on the information that you want to share. So as we've become more complex in society, this issue has taken on different characteristics. And there have been various high-profile cases in recent years where honor and reputation has been attacked. Elsewhere in the Declaration of Human Rights, there's legal provisions in which one has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, which is a concept from American law that has made its way into the human rights. And I don't know that it originated in American law. I'm familiar with it in American law. I have been aware that in British law, for example, that same presumption does not exist in the same way. And if you are accused, you may have a little bit more difficult time defending yourself, because that same degree of presumption of innocence may not be extant. All of these are really interesting in modern society. And in the wake of recent developments in efforts at managing a large global population, for example, in the area of public health, we've had examples where in the desire for safety and privacy, people's comments, opinions, conversations have been monitored, and people have had their honor and reputation attacked in that context. That's just one high-profile area of application. I'm not really seeking to make a specific point of that, but use it as just one example. So this is one that's interesting, and one that is in contention, one that's in the balance, one in which there might be different interpretations or applications of this human right. What are either of your thoughts on this particular article?
Go ahead, Jafar.
Especially given that both of you are involved in different ways in disseminating information. disseminating opinions, opinions which might be contrary to prevailing opinions, to winds that blow in one direction, whether it be eastwards, northwards, southwards, or westwards.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as, we all have our, say, political opinions, but we also all have, say, our privacy when it comes to our medical privacy, say, and there's a lot of prejudices that people may have either of those points, and so if they become public information, then there's your job could be at stake, or your reputation could be at stake, and there's certain things that you have no control over, or that that should be protected insofar as opinions and views, so that you're not subject to I don't know, that's kind of how I'm seeing it now, because there's especially now, if you're in certain fields of service or work, then I've heard people say that they would never I have girlfriends that said they would never date a Republican, or people in business that would not want to hire someone who's of a certain political view. And then it would also go for sexual preference, or maybe you have a condition or disease that limits you, that you don't want people knowing about. So I think all those things, I mean, the list could go on and on. I think the one problem is that a lot of times people can't imagine a reason why we should have privacy until you actually have a concrete example, or it actually affects your life. You don't really see it very clearly.
Well, it's interesting that they say privacy, family, home, or correspondence, because there have, again, been high-profile instances recently here in America where people have shown up outside of people's homes, at their tables at restaurants, and interfering in that sense with their privacy, with their family, with their home. And of course, internet trolling is, a phenomenon, right, that's been going on, which is in a sense interfering with correspondence, depending on how that might be viewed. And of course, this is all different in social networks, but one of the actions that's now being taken in America is an increasing removal of freedoms and protections of social networks, right? Where there's legislation being proposed now to limit the protections that some of these platforms have for speech that's used on those platforms. They are going to be made responsible to a greater degree for the views and opinions of others, right? So this is an area of new exploration in terms of laws and culture, methods of use. I'm looking for the right words here, but the jury is out on how to solve this problem in the public square to make sure that this right is enforced. Daniel, do you have any comments, or perhaps in the way in which you on Planksip have looked at or addressed this issue? Do you have any issues there?
Yeah, certainly. We approach a new form of journalism. I'd like to call it cultural journalism. I think there's a crisis in North America, throughout the world, in fact. And journalism was supposed to, and still does, function as a watchdog for society. Right? This is the truth functioning within the media. This is the mechanism within media that is supposed to I guess challenge the authority, bring out the truth. But I find that it's also tempted and falls victim to the media cycle. And for anybody who's, just to clarify what the media cycle is, it's kind of the topics that are front in mind for the media for a while, and then they dissipate. And this can be something as big as the war in Ukraine, or something that the president is doing, or a global disaster, or a scandal from a corporation, the death of the queen, all sorts of things that happen. And we seem to have a focus, and then we move on. And the casualties and the victims and the people affected or affecting or displacing people, I think that investigative function is being overlooked, and it's not functioning properly. So the question begs to be answered, and that is, well, so, what's your solution? And I'm not saying Planksip has the solution, but we tend to focus on cultural journalism on a longer and time span. So I can imagine that there's similarities between somebody turning inward and turning to their community or their faith, and trying to kind of step outside of the cyclical nature of the media and focus on some of the cherished books of wisdom that we have turned to for generations. Does that make sense, Wade?
It absolutely does. Personally, I declared myself to be a media dropout for almost a decade. That was, more than a decade ago, but yeah, for exactly some of those reasons. And I do think it takes a serious conscious effort to adhere to a higher standard, right? And I'm going to use that moment to interject a thought that we'll come back and explore later. I don't want to dive into it now, but again, the context of these discussions is this idea around coercion, right? That the Declaration of Human Rights, or at least the Declaration of Independence, had these initial rights that were non-coercive, and that crossing the line between inspiring a higher standard to enforcing and or coercing people to attain to that standard, somewhere in the middle, because obviously we have laws, we have protection. Even this one here says everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. So the implicit or even the explicit statement here is no one shall be subjected to this arbitrary interference, to these attacks, and you have the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Well, then the answer is, well, when does the protection against the law cross the line and become the attack, right? When does the protection become that? And this is thus calls to defund the police, right? And we'll circle back to this later, but I've been noodling around on the idea of, the role of religion in society. What is it specifically that appeals to me about religion? And it is the fact that it should inspire you to a standard of higher behavior. And I would submit that you in Planksip are creating a culture of inspiring contributors and participants to attain that higher standard, to reach for a higher moral code than the bottom line of effectively utilizing that news cycle that you talked about, jumping into the fray and grabbing the attention, grabbing the eyeballs, grabbing the ears, converting that into monetary cash through advertising or other revenue sources, and then wash, rinse, repeat, wash, rinse, repeat every, 12, 24, 36, 48 hours. You have to stimulate that news cycle, right? Whether it's using, like sugar, salt, or crack cocaine, to stimulate the addicts who need to have that fix of whatever they're getting out of that news cycle. And yet what you're doing is inspiring to that higher standard of, hey, take a step back and read some of these worthy books that are like causing the deep swells in the ocean rather than the froth at the seashore.
I like that. That was beautiful. The end part was beautiful. You could be a Planck-SIP spokesperson, Wade. I think the only exception is that I'd want to stay completely objective from saying I'm creating a culture. I think culture is something that transmits generationally, and I, I wouldn't say that I'm creating a culture. I would say that I'm urging people to participate. Right. I mean, one of the things that I would add, and say, let me know what you think about this in terms of the role of religion. I think it inspires people to a higher moral plateau, possibly. Although I still have sympathy for some atheist roots, and I would say that I can experience a high degree of morality without religion, right? And yeah,
And I'm not inferring anything.
no. I'm just,
different.
And that's fine. But so for I think there's more to religion than just the moral push. I think there's a sense of community that religion can resubstantiate, and through the embodiment figures that it proselytizes, it can make you a better person, and can make a lot of people better people. It's an operating system that it's fairly easy to plug into. All you have to do is believe. All you have to do is have faith. Now, easier said than done. That's kind of a challenge. That's an individual challenge. But once you dial into that and you can see the manifestation of religion and God and good in society, then you do more. You you repeat things that do that, and you build on the wisdom of those that have come before you. I wanted to focus on the participatory nature of that, and I think that by participating in a religion, that's where the similarity in Planck-SIP is. Not that I'm trying to create a religion, but the participatory part of it. So if somebody's reading an ancient text, be it the Bible or the dialogues of Plato, for example, then I encourage people to write, create, make videos, create lectures. It's that act of creation that we all have within us that takes you to a higher level of authorship, and that's something beautiful, and that's what I'm trying to do with Planck-SIP.
Well, I find it interesting that you specifically called out the aspect of culture, because in religion, it can be skin deep. You can be going along with the culture. You can be going through the motions, literally, in a Catholic church of, genuflecting, and there's a rhythm that's taught that people go along with without necessarily understanding why, right? And then there are those who dig deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and the question is often, is this transformation coming from the inside out, or are we being molded by our environment by conforming to a set of standards that other people have come to accept, adopt, and in that sense are urging others to conform to? And again, somewhere there's a middle line between, whether one is encouraging or constraining or coercing people into conformity. Once a religion, let's say, becomes the majority religion, right, versus a minority religion. So that's just kind of a tangent on what you were saying, but I think it is interesting that for me, the interest is this transformation from within, to wrestle with the beliefs, the tenets, to independently investigate them, to approach them with a curious and a questioning mind, such that one is, pulling them apart and putting them back together again and making them one's own versus just going along with the prevailing, socially accepted set of behaviors.
Right. But can I challenge you a little bit on that, Wade?
Absolutely.
So what if somebody in your religion said, well, Wade, that's what you're pushing for is too much. You're not complying and you're not following the rules that were set out by the religion, and we think what you're doing is heresy. I like the guardrails you'd said before, like the ditch to ditch, right? So what Wade's doing is he's jumping from ditch to ditch on the other side of the interstate highway. He's just flying all over the place.
Have you been talking to other people in the religious groups that I've moved in throughout my life? Because that's always been where I've been at, right?
Yeah.
Even when I was a minister, right? And thus on the inside, right? The in crowd. When the ministerial conference at Colmar took place, it's in my first book towards the end. I don't want to take anything away from one or two other individuals, but from my perspective and what I saw take place at that conference, which was the assembled ministry from all over Europe, because I'd had a previous relationship with the professor, Dr. Stavronidis, who was unveiling his 26 videotape at the time lecture series on the nature of God and pushing the denomination that I was a part of, the world, and it wasn't even a denomination because we were already heretics because of our belief. We were heretics in the Christian world because we rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, right? So we couldn't even call ourselves a denomination because as a body we were heretics. But within that body now we wanted to become more mainstream, or the leadership wanted to become more mainstream, and they were pushing the doctrine of the Trinity. And because of my experience with Dr. Stavronidis in the class that I had my freshman year called Latin Literature and Translation, for which he had given me an F for my efforts, and I got put on academic probation because I had no business being in that class as a freshman. It's a long and fun story in that they didn't let me register because of certain financial issues, and by the time I did register, there were no classes available, and my academic advisor, because I spoke several languages, said, "Oh, you'll do great in this class." And it was a senior level class, small, intimate. This was a Greek philosopher, right, conducting the class, and I was not capable of competing with anything. Or anyway, so I was given an F, put in academic probation, and for 4 years I lived in fear, knowing that I had to pass Dr. Stav's biblical scholarship class to get my degree, right? Which I managed to pull an A out of, and I had a great relationship with Dr. Stav, right? Because I came to understand and respect him. When I first was introduced to him, I didn't understand or respect. Well, I did respect him. I liked him as a man, but I didn't agree with what he was teaching or trying to do because he was challenging us to think, right? He was introducing these Latin classics, right, that you're familiar with. And I really couldn't deal with it from where I was coming from. Anyway, long story short, in that ministerial conference, I single-handedly argued him down and got him to agree in front of the assembled ministry that it was but his personal assessment of the text, and it was the most reasonable conclusion that he could come to, and that in fact nothing he had presented was proof of his position. I got him to admit that. So I was then kind of a hero for the rebels. My point is, I've always been in that situation, always challenging the convention. And, as a Bahai now, our faith claims to honor that to a degree within the guardrails. Those guardrails would include, you must accept that the writings come from a divine source, and that you must not be arguing with that divine source. But there's a lot of potential within that to understand it differently because there's no clergy, and therefore there's no orthodox opinion among the members of the community. Nobody has the right to insist that their view is correct. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the bywords is unity and diversity and independent investigation of the truth. But even within this context, absolutely, it's a challenge. It is not easy to approach this. But in this community, I have found one that, lays claim to these standards of independent investigation of the truth and honoring and respecting the differing viewpoints to achieve unity in diversity. But that it is a challenge. Absolutely.
And of course, unity and diversity means a different thing. And if we pull this back to, I mean, in a political sense, unity and diversity has been hijacked with a different semantic meaning. That semantic and meaning is the same thing, but it's different. And what I find that it's politicized in the same way that I try and stay away from liberal or conservative, but it's politicized in the way where virtue signaling is implies a higher moral character, and I think that can be dangerous and false on its face.
Absolutely. The first commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Virtue signaling, right, is doing exactly that. Do your deeds match your words? And that also is the litmus test of whether your words are even coherent. You follow me? Because when you put those words into practice, their duplicity and their hypocrisy becomes evident. But if you are an expert at professing things without actually having to back them up with deeds, in fact, being quite savvy to never actually commit with acts to prove that you believe what you've just said, you can get away with it. The minute you try to live it, your hypocrisy becomes more evident. And so there are those who are really expert at virtue signaling. It's all they do. They are adept at fencing with words, at attacking their opponents through virtue signaling without actually ever having to step on the battlefield of reality.
I love that way. That's really profound. So you're telling me, like, so in theory, could I take any story from the Bible and apply that same framework to it? So, I mean, do you think yes or a no? Is that something that would be possible?
Well, so I'm going to be brutally honest here. Many dance and fence around the Bible in the same way. In other words, try to apply it somewhat literally, but instantly then defer to, oh, it's symbolic, right? And so you can play these games. You can also proof text, right? And if you really know the Bible, like I do, I can pull up quotes that back up any position. So if I'm using the Bible as my evidence, it's circular, it's hermetically sealed, so the reality is I have to be able to live it in my life, right? And then the Bible is also more difficult because you have this evolution, right? We watched the video around human rights, and we saw how they have evolved over the last 4,000 years. Well, some of that evolution took place through the pages of what the Bible shows us and reveals. So we also cannot judge something from 4,000 years ago with the standards of today. This is a method that is often used by antagonists Well, if God is all powerful and all divine, then they can take something that's from the pages 4,000 years ago and show that with today's understanding, God's an idiot, right? That's the game. You
Yeah.
follow me?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that's not fair, and it doesn't work. And there are ways to counter that, but in the world of fencing with sound bites, no one ever cares because they really have a point to prove rather than getting at the underlying reality. This is kind of a long-winded answer, but yes, so the short answer is absolutely. God himself in the Word of God, the Bible says, "Prove me now herewith." He repeatedly asks us to test him, right? But the way in which he does it is you've got to take action, right? You've got to do it. You've got to put your money where your mouth is. You don't just get to argue words with God.
Well, let me give you one specific example that I've been wrestling with. Was it Genesis where Abraham has to sacrifice Jacob
Isaac, yep.
or Isaac? Yeah. So okay,
And in the Quran, it's Ishmael, which is interesting.
right? Yes. Okay. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so I'm not trying to put you into a corner at all. I'm just trying to think, what is your intuition about that in terms of the wisdom of relinquishing yourself to the Almighty above your own own child? And is it meant to be something that applies to Wade? Do you put yourself in that position, Abraham's position, and say, wow, that's amazing. That's like the ultimate test to be able to put my own blood before the knife and for the Almighty and for the belief. Like how do you process that?
So I love, what is it? Highway 61 Revisited by Bob Dylan addresses this. The narrative in that song is, Abe says to God, where do you want this killing done? And God said, out on Highway 61. I don't know if you guys know that lyric. I love that Bob Dylan song because he takes that to task, right? There could be 10 different ways to answer this question. I'm going to give you really quick a couple, right? The first one is there's much evidence throughout human history of people sacrificing their children to the gods, right? That is one context in which to view this, but I'm not going to go where you might expect with this. Basically, it's God saying, Abraham, do you trust me to the same degree as these other heathens, using the biblical term, right? Trust their God. They sacrifice their children to their gods. Are you willing to do that for your God? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, which Christians have done throughout history, right, is to say God was helping Abraham understand and subsequent generations understand the sacrifice that God himself was going to make when his declared only begotten son was sacrificed for the sins of others. And again, the metaphor here was Isaac was to be sacrificed on an altar to God. The third thing is God never intended Abraham to actually go through with it. And so God also then showed Abraham that it's not something that a real God would ever require. And so these, again, wrong, incorrect views of who and what God is. He brought Abraham to the brink of doing it and then made Abraham look at himself and says, what did you just about do? Did you really think that I, the true God of all things, would require it or would want you to do such a thing? And another way to look at it is, yes, I do, in fact, try to teach my children that their relationship to God is the most important thing in their life, more than any other relationship. But that, as Jesus taught, if you want to show that you love God, then you must love your neighbor, right? So no matter how much it hurts, no matter how painful or difficult, you show your love to God by actually loving your fellow man, even when with every fiber of your being you want to do something different. Love him because you see God in him and because that is what God wants you to do. So there are all kinds of ways of looking at this, but now we're getting into, perhaps fluffy, airy ways to just explain it away. And the cynic and the critic will never accept any of those explanations because they'll be just like, oh, come on, you know.
No, but I think, I mean, maybe it's a long roundabout way of doing this is that I think I'm also a heretic or iconoclast, whatever you want to say, a very similar kind of kindred spirit to you, Wade, in the fact that I do exactly what you're saying. I think about it, I process it, I question it, I try and synthesize it, and I think, from the litmus of goodness, what is the ultimate social good from a story or a wisdom like that, right? Or what is an ultimate good from that particular story? And we've touched on a lot of it, right? And I think biblical scholarship touches a lot on that story. It has a very unique ability in terms of a written section within the Bible to kind of push you down to your core. I mean, there's lots of the Bible and other classical written material that can kind of elevate you and make you feel wondrous and let your imagination go and but this kind of viscerally keeps you grounded and raw and humble. It's quite an amazing effect as you read it. And I encourage anybody who's maybe listening to this, a more secular approach or philosophical approach would be to pick up Fear and Trembling from Soren Kierkegaard. And I'm curious from other religious listeners, though, right? I really am. If somebody who is religious and they say the Bible is the only book that I need to refer to, ask yourself, is there any value to picking up a book from Soren Kierkegaard and going through it? Because that's exactly what what he focuses on is on this particular story in that book.
Well, and it's an excellent citation, that book by Kierkegaard. And there is I know we've got a couple of viewers. We've got a Catholic viewer up north here in Wisconsin who is involved in, I forget what it's called, but the confirmation, teaching the catechism to youth. And he also likes to challenge even the doctrines. So that the youth can do exactly that, wrestle with it as they make it their own. And there's another gentleman here locally who's more of a Protestant background. We might have either one of those on the show to dig into a little bit more about what you're talking about. I want to transition now to our silent Emmy-nominated documentary
that was
filmmaker.
amazing. I didn't say there was no opportunities to say congratulations, Jafar.
Yeah.
That is. Are you excited about that? I mean, you must be. That's probably really big news.
Yeah, I'm a little excited to go to the event. It's but yeah, I'm not much of a event person, so.
Suits and limos and whining and dining in New York, right?
Yeah, that's not my thing, but what we're talking about is, and I had thought. Just as far as how people approach text, and I think it's relevant to the struggles that society is going through right now and the way that we approach maybe each other and text, because you can look at a book like the Bible. There's a lot of different attitudes you can look at it through, a lot of different glasses you can look at it through. You can look at it through a critical glasses, or you can look at any text and have the attitude towards the author of, okay, maybe this guy's got something to say. Maybe I'll try to hypothesize positive meanings towards what's going on in the text. Or you can look at it with a critical attitude and say, I don't like this guy, so I'm going to find out how to deconstruct it and pull it apart and dismantle it so that I can prove it wrong. And I think both those are valid at times. They're both useful, but I think that
Jafar,
Wade, you can speak to this. Like, I think that is not the. It's kind of like a challenge. It kind of like defines the person, how they're able to struggle with text or with reality.
so I want to use this as a segue, Jafar, into the human right article that you chose, while answering another aspect of your question, Daniel, because I cited one of my favorite professors, even though he failed me. I have one of my top people of all time, Dr. Stavronidis, right, for teaching me to think. Another professor from my undergrad degree, Dr. Richard Page, both of these men have passed on in the meantime because I'm no spring chicken. And they were, after all, my seniors and, august professors in their own right when I was a young guy. But Dr. Richard Page and his class in ancient Israel was just astounding, and he prepared me to participate in the City of David archaeological expedition in Jerusalem through studies into biblical archaeology and ancient Israel, including getting real nitty-gritty with map studies, right, of all the different wanderings. And we spent an entire semester literally charting courses on the map to understand the topography and the geography around what was claimed to be history in the Bible. And one of the most stunning lectures, and it didn't even sink into me at the time, but over the years I've reflected on this, was the land purchase that Abraham made. When you mentioned Abraham, I didn't know where you were going at first with Isaac, but Abraham made a land purchase. So I view the Bible largely as literature. The Bible, for students of the Bible, is typically broken into three parts. And when I say the Bible, I'm talking now about the so-called Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, right? The law, the prophets, and the writings, right? So the writings are often considered to be literature. Well, the prophets are also literary masterpieces, and even the law is literature, right? The first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the Torah, it is a literary masterpiece. And so one way to look at the Bible, as you mentioned, Jafar, is to look at it as literature. And when one does, with an honest, objective mind, it stands head and shoulders above much of the rest of writings in terms of literature, right? But there's so much more. There is real history, and this one lecture, Dr. Page went into this record of a land purchase, and he showed, using real sources, how this story in the Bible meets the criteria of a legal land deed, and that other artifacts that have been discovered from that same time period show that this was intended as a legal document, the literal recording of a land deed. And as such, it's one of the oldest recorded real estate transactions with the legally valid elements of a land purchase. Right? It is literally a recorded land deed. When you buy a house and you have your title insurance and you go to closing, and then you get the recorded deed. Mm-hmm. That's what that is, which is this. So that's another aspect, Daniel, about how the Bible, do I view the Bible in literal terms? I absolutely do. Now, Jafar, this is the segue to the article that you wanted to share, which was, I believe, Article 17, right? Is that correct?
Right.
Which I can showcase here. And this gets into, Daniel, a really interesting discussion on modern society and where we're headed. I'm just going to post it here and then share it. Really interesting discussion on where we're headed as a society and what the standards are for human civilization going forward. So, Jafar, over to you.
Yeah, well, so the Article 17 just states that, what is it there? Everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. And then there's a second part to it there. Maybe don't have it on there.
Is it Article 18, freedom of thought, conscience? No,
oh, maybe that's the two bits. That's okay.
Yeah, no one shall be arbitrarily
right, okay.
deprived. That's the second part.
Yeah, so I did a little bit. We've talked about the Greeks in the past, and the growth of ancient Greece and the land ownership that some of the Greeks were able to acquire, and they were able to develop their wealth based off of their farming, and it allowed some autonomy and some just individual wealth that these farmers could pass on to their sons, basically. And so this changed sort of the attitude of the people. They went from being serfs or just extremely poor and peasant, and they didn't have any control over their future. They couldn't save up and pass anything down to their sons. They couldn't afford any sort of luxury, or they couldn't amass any sort of wealth or property in the form of, they didn't really have coin back then, but you couldn't store grain, or you couldn't store any sort of wealth. And the rich people might have like bars of gold or something. But so the difference psychologically for an individual when that person is able to own and preserve wealth into the future is I think huge. And I think we underestimate it when we downplay the importance of private property and entrepreneurship and business ownership. Because when you're able to have that that property that you can pass on into the future, your attitude towards the people around you and the land that you live on changes, because it's your responsibility to take care of that land, and it's going to be, to the degree that you take care of it, those around you will benefit from it, including your children. So it allows the individual to function morally, whereas if you have nothing, your ability to function morally and to get the byproduct of that moral functioning is a sense of meaning and place in culture. And sort of your friends and your family will look at you with admiration and meaning, rather than, it gives you that opportunity. And then there's also, if you believe in God, then there's that satisfaction of having done something, for the future. So I think that this is really important that people have access to that, to private property for that reason. And I think that's part of what made the Greek civilization flourish so much and allowed so much free thinking. 600 years before Christ, 500 years.
You can correlate that to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? But then, of course, in the modern era, we want some governmental entity or some other power to provide us with that. We feel entitled to have those lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, achieved or fulfilled, right? Shelter, food, right? And somehow that should be provided to every citizen, and that's necessary if you have not been given ample opportunity to take ownership. I love that phrase, take ownership. I began using it during the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I began to think, well, you can't occupy that which you do not own, right? And so there's this idea that, well, you shouldn't own the earth because the earth is our common heritage, right? So, but if individuals cannot own their own plot of land, there's this biblical metaphor for the millennium, right? The 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus Christ. Every man shall sit under his own fig tree, right? And that gives you the sense that every man has their little postage stamp land and they have their own fig tree. Every man shall sit under his own fig tree. And that's kind of like that aspiration of, well, everybody should have this. But if no one can own it, then somebody or something ends up owning and controlling it. The the idea, right? John Lennon, imagine no possessions. It's easy if you try. Well, we don't have to imagine it because we've seen the horrors of the effort to implement that. And we've had some discussions, and one can explore models of how this gets done. And in fact, in the next show, we'll dig into this article about Patagonia, which is a major corporation that has now said Earth is our shareholder, right? They have declared, the founders have transferred ownership into two entities to help fight the climate crisis, Patagonia. And they were a private company. And in their press release of a week or so ago, they said they will transfer their entire ownership stake into two newly created entities. Those entities will ensure that the company's values will continue to be upheld and that Patagonia's profits are used to combat climate change. So we'll talk about that. We'll use that as this practical example, right, Daniel? We want to make it real. We don't want to virtue signal. We want to, test our ideas and hypotheses in reality, and we can use Patagonia as a way to do that. It's an evolution of the triple bottom line and the ESG movement around, how corporations need social responsibility. But I want to make a point here to distinguish a corporation from a person, right? Those are two very different things. And when we talk about it, we'll try to keep that in mind. The idea that an individual should have ample opportunity to take ownership so that he or she can sit under their own fig tree and can provide for their children and their family and teach their children to become self-sufficient and not be dependent on some other entity to provide their basic human needs. Which is, of course, not at all to say that those who have been, for whatever reason, unable to take ownership, whether their own or the failings of someone else or some other government or institution, the failing of allowing them to take ownership, they still should be cared for and protected, which is, again, the whole point of Matthew 25, right? When you saw me naked, you clothed me. When you saw me thirsty, you gave me water. When you saw me hungry, you gave me food to eat. The nations will be judged on their ability to deliver that minimum standard. Because again, Matthew 25, as we've covered in past shows, is not about individual performance. It's not about you as an individual giving a glass of water. Of course it is. Of course it is also that. But the actual literal statement is Jesus, the Son of Man, when he returns in his glory, will judge the nations. And the standard upon which he will judge the nations is, did you, the nations, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give water to the thirsty, right? Which is fascinating in terms of unity and diversity, because different nations have been trying to do it in different ways. Different nations have been trying to do it in different ways. Different nations have used different methods to try to achieve this goal. Some have been more successful, some have been less successful. Are we applying our minds to judge the methods of government application? The kings have all been dethroned, largely speaking. We have democracies. We participate in the act of governing, just like, Daniel, you talk about Greece. Today we participate, and the different peoples have hoisted up different governments and different leaders, or they have been foisted upon them. We have information sharing. We can look around at the nations. We can literally participate in the act of the Son of Man coming in his glory and judging the nations. In fact, we're supposed to. We're supposed to use our minds, as we talked about earlier in the show, to wrestle with these things, to make them our own, to evaluate, to discern, or as somebody said in a recent show, one of the commentators, to sift through the information without political bias, please. Independent investigation of the truth. To sift between the models, which ones are working better, which ones are feeding the hungry, which ones are clothing the naked, right? Which ones are delivering starvation, which ones are delivering, mass death, which ones are impoverishing entire people under the authority and control of corrupt enrichment schemes by those who are in power, right? it's not really talking about what we do as individuals anymore. I mean, yes, it is. Yes, it does. But are we working at changing our communities and our nations into a model that does that? And I am one who, and I'll stop here in a second. I am one who believes that empowering, encouraging, giving opportunity for individuals to take ownership is that which delivers the success of that, while of course taking care of the needy and the poor and the sick and the homeless and the underprivileged, but with a focus on teaching them to fish rather than giving them a fish.
I mean, this is what everyone wants. Like when I talk to my friends who are employees, and they talk about their jobs, they don't know it, but they all want to run their own business. You know, a lot of, if they're complaining, it's because they
All
secretly
of
want to.
them,
Well,
all of them.
Usually when they're complaining, it's because they're not getting to make the decisions, and they're not, finding the meaning and so on from it. So that, sort of secretly they do want that. But
They
they don't
probably
necessarily
also
want
want
the
a safety
responsibility.
net, right?
Yeah.
They want a safety net,
They
right?
might
They
not
want
want
to
the
have your cake
responsibility.
and eat it too.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not easy, to go watch the show Alone, right? on whatever, where these people go and live alone until, they can't take it anymore and try to provide for themselves. It's not easy. There's a balance. You can't really do it alone, and that's also part of the message, right? Building healthy, vibrant communities, which can be self-sustaining and can teach people to fish in their own circumstances, in the creeks and rivers that flow through their neighborhoods. What are you going to do? There are so many wonderful examples. Any of you seen that documentary about the guy who started teaching these inner city kids to grow vegetables in these little plots by the sidewalk, and it turned into this huge venture? Anyway, there's examples all over the place
Also
of that kind of
yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Daniel, you've been silent. Anything you want to share on this topic?
This is enormous. This is an enormous topic. One that I think, for me, I wrestle with about 30% of my mind daily. I'm serious.
It's the topic, Matthew 25. When the Son of Man returns in his glory, he will judge the nations on this topic.
So what I was trying to think of what is the best way to descend into this. You did a really good job, Wade, but I want to maybe cite a book from Wallace Wells. And he taught it's going to be a climate alarmist book, and it will basically say that the Holocaust was a warm-up exercise compared to what we will go through as a result of the climate. Now, I mean, between refugee displacement, trying to go and work through tipping points in climate disaster, we're talking about billions of people suffering and dying. Now, okay, let's put that on one side, and then we say, how do I approach, manage, aspire to build and create my own castle of prosperity and property and wellness to then say pass down to my children? Like, how do you reconcile that?
Well, let me say I want to address your perspective in the way you want me to address it. But I first have to say, and we'll circle back to it, but I first have to say that I believe you're presenting a false dichotomy. And I believe that the reason is, and I can show you why I feel that way with evidence, the things that book catastrophizes about that you've just described, I haven't read the book, but what you've just described is already happening. And it's not happening because of climate change. It's happening because of political upheaval, right? We have massive migration issues going on already like never before. And yes, what you're describing will become even worse. But my point is, it's not just going to happen because of climate change, nor, and this is the false dichotomy part, nor is me buying a property in southern Wisconsin of 7 acres and planting cherry trees and planting apple trees and teaching my children to plant corn and beans and kale. We've got all the massive kale crop right now. We're making kale chips instead of, to try to have those instead of potato chips. And having chickens, we now have 4 eggs. Those eggs are $250 each because we spent $1,000 getting the chickens, getting the coop, getting the fence. So we're doing math, right, every day. Oh, yesterday these eggs were $333 a piece. Today they're $250 because we got another egg today. We now have 4 eggs from probably one of our 4 chickens, right? My point is, Daniel, we're not contributing to climate change by taking ownership of a sizable property for me and my family. We are actually part of the solution. That's why it's a false dichotomy, that part of it. And then the other part, I personally do not believe that climate change is the most pressing, urgent concern facing humankind. It still happens to unfortunately be, in my opinion, the threat of nuclear war and massive political upheaval. I mean, look what the refugee crisis that we had in Europe over the last decade, right? And what we have on the southern border of the United States, and what may or may not happen if China, attacks Taiwan, and what's happening in Ukraine. And one could say that the climate change is impacting and influencing some of this, and there's some limited degree of truth to that. But these fights and battles right now are not over scarce resources caused by climate change. They are 100% over political control and power. They really have nothing to do with climate change, broadly speaking, but climate change is one of the weapons being used by some of the people in order to gain political control. And so climate change to me right now is the tail wagging the dog. Right now, I'm not saying that there's not a future risk. And I'm not saying I am happy that scientists are working on climate change, but I do not for 1 second believe it is one of the most pressing, one of the top 3 or 4 issues that we have to face as a species right now. I just don't personally feel that it is one of the top 3. Perhaps this issue, right, of should people or should people not be allowed to have land ownership, right? That is perhaps a more pressing issue because for some reason that still hasn't been resolved, despite the failure, in my opinion, of the experiment in the Soviet Union, in Cambodia, and even in China on that issue, right? And is the American model the perfect one? I don't necessarily think so. There are various economies in Europe that have hybrid socialist models, and in America we have an intense visceral fear of many Americans, right? Perhaps 100 million Americans have an intense visceral fear of socialism. Having lived for 15 years in socialist countries, primarily Sweden and Germany, but also England, France, and Switzerland, I don't have that. And being born in Canada, Daniel, Canada, another example, I don't have that visceral fear of socialism. Mm-hmm. But I also know what the risks and dangers are about how over time people to become dependent on a nanny state and lose that whole ability to teach themselves to fish. They gradually over time abdicate their personal responsibility in favor of somebody else taking care of them. And at some point, again, a tipping point, the tipping point on that issue is perhaps as scarier to me than the tipping point of climate change, because it's already happening right now, not in 20, 50 years from now, right? You follow me? So I'm not diminishing the threat of climate change. I'm just saying it's not, to me, the most pressing.
Yeah, I wrestle with it. I mean, I think I agree with you with your assessment of the false dichotomy. I think it's very abstract to think about that. I
And then
don't.
begin to coerce, right? Then begin to create policies and laws and try to insist that everybody, conform to something that some think tank has thought up. You know what
Yeah,
I
but
mean?
I can hear the tone. I mean, maybe going back to what Jafar was saying. I mean, this is in a tradition of Locke. This is a very like individual property rights are. I think they're too entrenched in our laws. I just don't think it's even possible to do to arbitrarily take it away as it was explained in the and that word arbitrary is a really interesting word, right? So let's say for example, and well, this happened in Canada when the Japanese were a threat to North America in World War II. Japanese populations in Canada were put into internment camps, and property was seized. But I mean,
Well, let me give you an example.
no.
It's been happening for decades, many decades, and it's enshrined in the law already that you can be forced to sell your property to pay the taxes on the property. You may own the property free and clear, but it may be your only asset, and you can be forced to sell that property because you owe taxes on that property. That may not seem like a big deal to you, but it actually fundamentally erodes this right over time. And again, that some undeclared entity, in this case a government that declares the right to tax your property, ends up
Not just
aggregating control of all the property.
it's not just taxes. If inflation continues, then that's gonna, you won't be able to afford the taxes also. So it's like taxes and inflation will just wipe out people's property rights.
You guys, it is a tough situation. I mean, I don't know what your property values are worth in the United States. Wade, you say you have, what, 4 acres or something like that in Wisconsin?
We bought 7.5 acres this March.
Right.
We moved out of the city. We moved 20 minutes south of where we were, and bought a piece of land with a house on it. And now we have chickens. We planted grapes and cherries and jalapenos and habaneros and tomatoes and cucumbers and squash. And yeah, and we're trying to become, somewhat self-sufficient in the food supply, which again, then you don't have to transport the food. It's all good for the climate. It's all good for the environment.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you're giving your children valuable, valuable skills on how to provide for themselves. I think there's a lot of wisdom
But
in
but again,
that.
I have to defend this because of the prevailing winds of dogma in the minds of those who are buying into madness around these soundbite, in the name of the science, people spouting things they have no clue what they're really talking about, the complexity of, the global system of food supply and production. And I'm talking about the average population that's picking up on the politicized sound bites around
Mm.
this topic that again are being used. I'm not saying even with intent, or certainly not with evil intent. That intention can be the best, right? Of just to educate people on the reality, but it's a consumer, lap up this idea that there are these evil people out there destroying the planet, and if we could just force them to conform, then we would have nirvana. Right, that's been sold to humanity over and over and over again, and we keep falling for it over and over and over again.
I can't let you get away with that though, Wade. I mean,
It's a
like you're
caricature. It's definitely a caricature.
okay. Well, I guess my point that I wanted to make about the property values is, we've talked about Professor Keene before, right? About his outlook, and there's pretty much a housing crisis, right, around the world, and I would admit that I do admit that the the crisis is perpetuated by and politicized, right? But I don't want to get into that. What I want to get into is the fact that the housing crisis is a really interesting thing, and it's probably in Jafar's city, it's in Wade's city, it's in my city, and the question comes into affordability. And when you really break it down and you think about, okay, well, if we want to make things more affordable in neighborhoods, maybe the prices have to come down. And so, let's say that my property is worth $1 million, okay, or two. And if it decreases, by 50%, then all of a sudden I could be backwards on my mortgage, or
right. The bank's going to end up owning it in the current situation, in the current structure. Right, and affordability really has to do, and so it's really interesting. Like, I've tried to put, how you actually have to have anybody that's virtue signaling around climate change actually walk the talk and talk, or walk the talk and walk the walk, right? So, but what is that talk? This gets back to the virtue signaling is completely divorced from reality, because they're gathering this scenario from the ether of science, and I don't mean that negatively. They're gathering this scenario from the ethos of science, and then they're delivering a salmon fillet because they claim that the ocean is boiling. And I'm trying to find the right analogy, and then they're prescribing some solution. But what does walk the talk even look like, right? What is that walk? What is it about that walk that is actually improving the situation for anybody? Right. Okay. And that's what I was trying to do. Is there even a walk? I believe I'm walking the walk more than somebody else who is talking the talk, because of what I just described and what we've done. But all of those people, and that most of the people who would be virtue signaling about it would look at me and target me as the evil one who's causing the problem, when in fact I'm probably one who's doing more to contribute to the solution. We all know you're good, right? Okay, that's not right. The point. No, it is. No, but that's no, where I need to say that. I need to say that okay. To move the process forward, because I want to go back to. No, that's so not my point. My point. No, it's not the point. It's not the point. I have to supersede. No. I have to supersede you on this one. I happen to be familiar. I get that. I get all that. I happen to be familiar with a situation. It could be, and it could be your son, your daughter, your aunt. It could be a climate change activist themselves, but they might not be doing it in the same way, or they might be. I don't know, but so I'm just familiar with that, and I can say specifically that I think this is a better thing than that. That meant nothing. It added nothing to it, because your approach is different. And when I say that you're righteous, you are righteous. I'm giving you a compliment. You are inwardly looking at what you can do to provide for your family, and you're doing that. So I'm not including you in this example. I'm including the people. You trivialize climate change, right? So let's look at the people who are not trivializing climate change, right? People who are waving the flag, saying, I don't trivialize climate change, but fine, go ahead. If it's an emergency relative to somebody else, perhaps. Okay, right. So my point is that if you have somebody who is really behind the housing crisis, as an example, okay, and if they were going to walk the talk, and this is where the rule should apply to them, not to Wade, right? I'm saying, would you, in your neighborhood, not you, not Wade, but the person who is virtue signaling about climate change, or about the housing crisis, or would you
lower the value of your property so that you could put 100 more houses in that neighborhood. And then all of a sudden, the not in my backyard syndrome starts to emerge.
Well,
Right?
absolutely. We could talk about, the busing of immigrants around the United States and the reaction to some of those who are now receiving them in their backyard and what they're saying, right? That's an actual concrete example, right? Those who have been talking to the southern states and, demonizing them as being racist, xenophobic, whatever. But those people that are now busing some of those immigrants that are flooding their cities, to areas further removed, to those bastions of elite thought that think open borders are great. And there's, you can go Google and find out what's
Yeah.
being said in the American. That is an actual concrete example of
Yeah.
what you're talking about. But my point is different, Daniel. My point is that it doesn't compute for me. You'd have to really draw me a diagram, show me the formula as to how anyone reducing the value of their home helps with the housing crisis. It doesn't, right? That's, again, it's like when I was in Germany at age 28, I ended up in a hospital, lose my eye. And the reason I was about to lose my eye, I found out much later, was my immune system was attacking my eye and it was destroying the optic nerve, right? Because the pressure was so building up in the eyeball that I would have gone permanently blind. And they gave me cortisone injections into my eye, and they saved my eye. Then they wanted to continue to give me cortisone to ease the pain that I was experiencing in all kinds of other areas of my body because of this autoimmune condition. And I refused because I knew enough about cortisone to say, that's just going to make it worse. You saved my eye with a massive direct intervention, and I'm grateful to those doctors in that German clinic. But then they wanted to get me a program of sustained treatment of this symptom of pain, which would have made it worse and guaranteed the outcome that they were saying was going to happen, which was I was going to be in a wheelchair at age 40, is what they told me. I refused, and I went rogue, and I read 100 books, and I studied into the immune system and health. And lo and behold, 10 years later, it was in complete remission. I've got x-rays and everything to prove it. Again, this is in my first book. And they told me, if you ever find anything that works, come back and tell us, because we're really looking for solutions to this disease. But I couldn't, because there's no silver bullet. There's no medication. There's no drug, right? I had to completely transform who I was, how I thought, what I ate, how I exercised, everything about myself. I had to become a completely different person in order to overcome this disease. I had to become well, right? My point is, the system of systems of what's causing the housing crisis is so complex. The cortisone injection in one single neighborhood might provide some kind of limited relief, while actually metastasizing and probably hurting everybody in that community over a decade. You follow me? Just based on and I've worked in the world of finance, right? I worked for Countrywide, the largest origination and consumer of wholesale mortgages in America. I've told the story about Angela Mazzillo being on the cover of Time magazine for the economic meltdown. I just happen to have all these experiences that give me deep personal knowledge of how this expletive deleted works, right? And how it doesn't work, and why it works for now and why it doesn't work. And the whole system has to be transformed. Somebody lowering the value of their house would be just another form of virtue signaling, right? It would be
but you're
painful,
totally, I'm talking about a system-wide
right
thing. So the vote from that person who lives on the street that says we need to do something about homelessness, okay? This is and so let's vote in the government that is going to limit the financeability of the amount of finance that you can take out on a property. Okay? Now, what Keene says is that you've got too much finance, too much like in multiple of finance that you can do and leverage yourself to buy the property. Right? And if you limited that, then the property values would instantly come down.
Is there a segment of Keene's interview that addresses this? Because maybe we can do this in the next show.
Right.
Fans
Okay,
tune back in.
yeah.
And the next show we'll bring that. We'll also bring the Patagonia example.
That's an
Well,
excellent example. That's really interesting. Yeah,
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 we'll talk about those two things because I love the topic that you're raising, but it really needs to be unpacked. And I'd like to hear
yeah.
specifically what Keen says about it. I'm not intimately familiar with his specific argument as to why this works, why this might work, but let's take the time to unpack it, to explore it, to digest it, because my my idea of how to solve this is very different. I'd like to compare and contrast my idea with Keen's. I'm not rejecting your idea because I'm just against your idea. I have this perspective that is holistic. Within that holistic model, I don't see that solution working. But if Keen's really worked on it and thought through it, I'd like to understand his reasoning, his rationale. He probably sees things that I don't.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, and it's not my position. It's more, it's trying to think about it and challenge it in ways that I see that one side of the political divide is pushing, and I try and understand that the merit of that side.
Right.
I
Here's what I
understand.
absolutely love about what you said. I absolutely love making people put their money where their mouth is, right? So if somebody is virtue signaling, make them prove it. Whatever it is, they will either prove their point or learn that they were wrong. And
Yeah,
it's
I
not
mean,
about it, it's not about proving them wrong, it's about finding a solution that works, but to just mouth off about it without being willing to put your money where your mouth is, right? And really work for it. And not, instead of trying to change the minds of other people, be the change that you want to see in the world.
well, that's what that's what the example of Patagonia is so interesting to me. I mean, I'm gonna consult the Google Oracle and see if I can read more about that. I think that's fascinating.
Well, it's something
I
that's
don't
been
know
going
what
on
a
for a while in different, but they're a big company that's taken a big step, right?
yeah, that's very interesting. Now, will the market eat them up and there in 10 years there's no more company? I don't know.
Well, there's also a debate about fiduciary responsibility. They can do it because they're a private company, but
Right.
other companies, they have an obligation to the shareholders, and virtue signaling with your entire company is illegal because the shareholders have bought into the company and given you that power with the expectation that you're focused on the bottom line. That's part of the evil. And years ago, I blogged a lot about corporations being Frankenstein monsters. We literally create a legal entity that has agency and power, and then we make
Oh,
it,
that's beautiful. That's really I like that
well,
Frankenstein comparison.
and
Yeah.
then we make it not accountable for the havoc that it wreaks.
Wow, that's really good. Mary Shelley would
And
be
they grow
very proud.
very large. They grow very large, and they're no longer
Ah!
they're no longer they're no
That's a clip.
longer
Let me do it again. Ah!
they are no longer a legal entity called a limited liability corporation. But guess what? They are limited liability. What does that mean? Limited liability. They can wreak havoc, and they are protected because they have limited liability. They are quite literally a Frankenstein monster, figuratively speaking.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that. Well, you're the, your position is the bane of the existence of anybody who's really aggressively trying to do anything about climate change. And the reason is because they will come up with all sorts of ideas on how to do things, and I can imagine, it's like me going to my accountant saying, "I have a great idea," and he's like, "No."
Right?
Well, wait. How about that? No. How about no?
Right.
Can I buy a yacht and write it off? No.
If you want to end up in jail, yes, you can. Right?
Right. So.
But it
Here's the
shouldn't
thing.
be that way. That's not fair. Well, go work on that legally. To your point, elect different people, right? But we
But
just elect scary people who are demagogues who can get the people to follow them on some to put it nicely, harebrained idea.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, I know there's a lot of harebrained ideas, but it seems like the status quo is more like, actually, dude, you gotta wake up and go to school and work hard, and everything will be all right. And you know what? The thing I'm gonna say to you and all the audience is that, and maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll really go bad and
Well,
wrong, because look at the civilization in Rome. Somebody says, back in the good old days, you know what? You just go be a soldier and everything will be fine. And eventually you're retired and you get this little plot of land and you're all good. And then you know what? The Goths come smashing down and destroying your civilization. And those Goths that are coming are the climate Goths. That is happening. That is going to move forward, and it's going to make the economies and the world collapse. That's what I think. And what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? And just say, look, take climate change out of it, completely out of it. And this is the best I've been able to get in any kind of climate conversation, is to say, take climate right out of the conversation. Let's just talk about biodiversity integrating into our environment. And anybody that says that we're above that, I think, wow, we have a lot to learn. And
haven't
nature
learned the
is
lessons
going
of the
to
Dust Bowl.
and nature's gonna win, and we're going to suffer. And
Well, and
you
this
know,
is why I absolutely insist I'm not remotely trivializing climate change. I just see it as a more distant threat that is, yes, absolutely, absolutely, if we continue on the path we're on, it will in fact take us out. As surely as, 5 billion years from now, the sun will engulf the earth, right? There's no,
but
there's
don't
no,
make that comparison when
well, no, but
look at
it's
the
it's
amount of
fair.
structural.
It's fair. It's fair because if you open your eyes to what is happening today and what is likely to happen tomorrow,
It's a distraction, Wade. It's a distraction.
It's not.
No. I'm saying all of the plans that need to be put into place in order to hit and exceed, the climate, I don't know, goals, right? Need to happen immediately. And you say, well, wait a minute, we don't want to do that because the bigger threat is nuclear. So let's not do that. Well, it doesn't make sense, Wade. It doesn't make sense.
Look, here, let me try to come up with an analogy that is not just a caricature, that has the necessary complexity to try to convey what I'm trying to share, but is simple enough, to still be on the back of a napkin. Is that fair?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'd love
Okay.
that.
So let's say you have 1,000 people, and those 1,000 people should absolutely be aware that in a year this crisis is going to unfold that is going to destroy all their hopes and dreams. Okay. But those 1,000 people completely disagree on the severity, the priorities, and in order for them to avert that crisis, they really all need to work together.
Mm-hmm.
But they're nowhere near
Mm-hmm.
being able to work together. And they also need to survive the year in order to avert that crisis.
Yeah.
But what 10%, let's say 50, let's say 100 of those people are saying, we need to divert all our resources to this crisis. And another 100 are saying, no, because I need to go, plant the food and harvest the food that we're going to eat this spring. Because if we don't have that food, we're not going to be around to avert the crisis.
Yeah.
And then those 50 or 100 are saying, you're trivializing the issue. No, I'm not. I just want to make sure that my kids can eat tomorrow, even though I agree with you that this crisis is coming a year from now.
Right, and I have a solution that will allow you for your children to be fed through
But
the
I don't
year.
believe you. I absolutely don't believe you, and I don't trust you at all. And what you are proposing is going to cause my children to starve this spring before winter ever comes. So that's the challenge. And in the meantime, we're going to kill each other because we're
Right.
trying to force each other to do it the way somebody else wants, and we haven't found the mechanisms on which to even agree. And now I'll explode it onto the world stage. One of the biggest offenders is China, and yet China is the one that virtue signaled the most, and it's the China Accords or whatever. And I'm not, you'll torpedo me in my facts here, but you know, China is the single biggest concern, in my opinion. The rest of the world wants to do everything it can, and it should. But if China doesn't, then we're going to all die anyway. And I'm exaggerating to the point of caricature, but you get my point. This is some of the debate that's going on, and it's legitimate debate. And so, but then others are saying, no, well, forget about China. You need to do it. But then, what if China doesn't? Then why am I doing it? And by the way, we're weakening ourselves. And China is saber rattling, and they're about to take over Taiwan, and that's going to throw us into nuclear World War III. So forget about climate change. I'm not going along until we right. So it's just one of 50 examples I could bring up.
Yeah, I feel you. I feel it. I feel the frustration, and I come from that camp that's trying to, to push you into doing something. And at the end of
But
the day,
I
no,
am.
but
Yeah, right.
the stuff that I want you to do, Wade, I know what you're doing. You're very
Exactly.
virtuous. You're
What do you
doing.
want me to do? What do you want me to do, Daniel? What should I do?
We need it. Well,
What are you
listen
trying to
to
push me into doing?
well, listen to what the scientists are saying. We have to meet these responsibilities by 2030, by 2050. We need to cut
What
the carbon.
responsibility do I have? What can I personally do?
Well, that's the wrong answer. Okay, like if you pull up a thing no, seriously. I tried to explain this to somebody the other day, and I said, look, let's make it very, very simple. Okay, do a screen share, right? Pull up Google and look at our current CO2 in the atmosphere right now,
Okay.
and I think we're at 400 and some parts per million. Okay.
Agreed. Okay. Next.
Okay.
Now what?
How are we going to lower that and to an acceptable standard, for the globe? How
So-
are we going to do that if it's not through governance? If it's not through
Okay. So what are you telling me to do? Are you telling me to vote for somebody else? Who should I vote for? What do you want me to do? At this moment, I'm willing to do it. What is it I'm supposed to do?
no, you're doing everything that you need to do. I'm saying, how do we change it so that number comes down? I'm not saying what do you do. I'm saying
It's almost
how
like-
does we as a species make that number come down?
I think everybody should do what I'm doing. I say that jokingly. My
No,
point is
fair
right.
enough, right? But okay, extrapolate that model. Can everybody do that? Can we all live on a farm and do what Wade's doing? No, we can't.
I believe we can. We should disband the cities. We should.
Well, there you go. Now you're on that side. So now Wade's going to go for a political party that says we move as an exodus out of the cities, all move to, farmland, and all start cultivating and living more sustainably. And
And
so
I
there
put
you
my
go.
money where
You've
my
just
mouth
joined
is.
the
We're-
Green Party. You've just joined the Green Party.
Well, we have. We are doing that, but
You
no,
have.
because I say we, my wife, myself, my two
Right.
kids, and my two
Right.
cats, right, and our chickens. We're doing that. That's what I mean by we. So, but I'm not a member of the Green Party because there's a whole bunch of other stuff
that you
that
don't
I
agree with.
Don't agree with, right? But some of those aspects I do. So I refuse to join a political party. It is literally against my religion to join a political party.
I always get caught up in giving examples that kind
Right.
of cut the argument down at the knees, but it's not the essence of what the argument is. It's like Wade's in that side, even though he's not now in the party, right? Like he's
Well,
saying,
that's why I
yes,
said I'm
let's-
not. That's why I said I'm not trivial. I am not trivializing climate change by any stretch of the imagination. But I am against coercion.
I
which
know
is-
that. I realize that. So
So I'm
person
trying to
A.
inspire others by, we had a camp on our property, right? And we had actually one of, and I got to be careful now how I say this because I have the utmost respect for this person who's probably not watching, but he would be very much of the kind of person that you're describing, right? Way over on that side, to my perspective, almost obsessed with the science, right? And he came and we invited him to participate, and he brought seeds and plants and enzymes, and we had a discussion where he educated the children, and some of them just loved it. Jafar, you were there, you filmed it, right? And we have this little portion now of our property that he personally planted, and he gave us these potatoes as a housewarming gift in these fabric containers that he had planted in his little apartment where he lives with his mom. And he has the opposite, right? It's like a tiny house kind of approach, but he's studying into soil and what the soil needs and how to create organic soil. So, but we integrated that into our big property, and guess what? These two perspectives that are kind of coming at it from the opposite united around this idea of what can we do? And Jafar, maybe we can share some images from the footage that you shot at our camp on a future show, because after all, you're an Emmy-nominated videographer, and we literally have video footage of this event, of this person coming and helping teach some of these principles to the children. You follow me? So no, I'm not trivializing it at all, but the problems are complex and difficult and thorny to solve.
I can't. Can I just run one idea by you guys? I can't help to see this. Let's call it an argument, as there's two sides, like ways of representing one side, and those obviously represent the other side of the issue. And I don't know that there's any. It's partly, is it not partly a problem of identity? Like I feel to some degree, Daniel,
Yes.
and I'm not trying to. I feel to some degree you want Wade to join you in sentiment, almost as that's almost as important as what Wade should be doing. And I don't know if that's the case, but I've had. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like,
Yeah.
Because it's like Wade is kind of being rebellious, and I'm not saying this is what you're doing, obviously, right? It's like obviously,
You got me.
Obviously, I'm kind of caricaturing now, but like Wade is saying I don't have to do that, and Daniel's saying, but look, this is obvious, and Wade is saying it's not so obvious, and it's almost like Daniel, you feel like he's just being rebellious and isn't being realistic, but I don't think I think it's to some degree a problem of identity, and I think it kind of summarizes the problem of identity the United States is having right now. And I do think it's somewhat fabricated. I think that the solution is something like we need to recast the identity of America or of the world in a way where everyone is included, so that we don't have these hair-splitting arguments, because I think that it's almost just hair-splitting. I mean, it's not always, but if we, I don't know, that's kind of what I'm seeing.
Political figures that claim that they want to unify,
right,
are often the most subtly divisive personalities, because it gets to this idea of coercion and conformity versus unity and diversity.
Yeah, I would put it the other way and say the ones that claim unity and diversity are the ones that are implementing coercion. Right? I mean, you know what parties I'm talking about, but I do acknowledge, and I might have a climate problem. Right? I might have such a massive overbearing bias on the climate.
I don't think
you view it as a defining issue, and I respect that.
But I don't know how to disentangle myself from it. So Jafar's comment of identity is interesting, and it could. Now the philosopher in me is going to say it's a perversion in a way, right? Like very quickly looking at it from a self, like a know yourself sort of standpoint. What good is it that I define myself by a climate catastrophe or like it where's the virtue in that, right? These are the foundations from which all of my ethical systems emerge from. So if I can basically learn to put the blinders on and not violate anything, like Wade's living a very virtuous life or righteous life in terms of how he's interacting with the environment, how he's teaching his children how to.
I'm also painting myself in a very favorable light when I.
No, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that's you're moving in the right direction, right? You could have chosen 100 different things to do. You and your wife could have chosen 100 different ways to raise your children, right? You could have moved in 100 different directions, right? But you chose to move to a place where, I know for other reasons as well, but I mean, if you're raising chickens and this is I think that's very commendable, righteous, and virtue by doing, right? I mean, that part I give a big check mark for. And I take nothing away from you on doing that. What I'm trying to do is really look at myself, and I think Jafar hit it right on the nail, right on the head. I remember a while back I was interviewing a fellow from the Muslim religion, and I asked him, what would could you live without your faith? And he tried a bunch of different answers, but the one that I thought helped his argument the most was that he wouldn't want to, and it wouldn't be him, right? That's his identity. He loves inhabiting that identity. Now, if I'm inhabiting an identity on the climate catastrophe, I have to really think about, is that a perversion? Well, in a way it is. I don't know if you guys see that. Meditate on that for a little bit.
Well, no, define what you mean when you say perversion. What do you mean? I mean, I know what the word means, but when you say, is that what is the fact that you want to identify, or that Jafar thinks you're identifying? I don't quite get
that I'm whatever
subject-verb relationship.
I'm actually just doing that. I'm being that. I'm inhabiting that. I'm emotional by that. I have that sense of urgency. It now defines my arguments and my thinking. It's part of my ontological framework of the way I see the world.
Okay. So, and I think conversely, that's why I so reject anytime somebody would say, oh, well, Wade, you're doing a good thing or you're virtuous. I don't want to identify with my good deeds. I don't want to do anything because of being seen as good or even seeing myself as good. Jesus set the standard when he said, why call you me good? There is none good. I just want to be.
I know, but it's such a fine line for you, right? Like, you tell the story, you tell everything about what you're doing and how you're doing it, so that you take the eye of the accuser off of you. Say, no, I'm doing this, so I don't do that. But then someone gives you the credit to say you're doing good. You say, no, I'm not that. Don't do that either. Don't say I'm good.
Because and the reason is because.
Is that the grace? Is that the grace is that the grace? You're living in a grace.
I'm a mad scientist that injects myself with my own serum constantly, right? I refuse to virtue signal. I do not want to speak about anything that I'm not actually doing. Hypocrisy is like, the ego is the Antichrist, and any form of hypocrisy where my words don't match my deeds. So I literally can speak to the fact that I'm doing it more eloquently than any theory. So I'm in this horrible situation of bringing the attention back to myself to explain the logic of my thinking, which I've actually proven because I've injected myself with the serum. But I loathe the fact that I'm talking about myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I get, but it's hard to like frame the example when we use you as the example, when you use yourself as the example, and then I acknowledge the example, and then you say no, that's don't.
But you could,
Don't do that. That's
but I
hard
don't
to.
want you to acknowledge me. I say, yeah, a person who does that is obviously, taking action against climate change, right? I'm not. You follow me? I, but also, to Jafar's point, I don't identify it. That's not why I'm doing it. I just believe it's
Why
a
are you
healthy.
doing it? Like we're
I'm
spinning in
doing it
circles
because
here.
it's
Why
a
are you
health.
doing it?
I'm doing it because it's a healthy, sustainable lifestyle, which I want to teach my children. I want to teach everything that I've been talking about this whole show. I want to teach my children to take ownership. I want to teach my children to know how to fish. I want to teach my children to become independent of anyone else, to not suffer from ego fantasies of being rich, but also not suffer from the fear of being poor or not being able to take care of themselves or being dependent on the state or the belief that somehow it's not possible for people to take care of themselves. I want them to inject themselves with the serum to know actually how to do it. The fact that I lived in a tent my senior year of high school in Alaska and survived was cathartic and powerful. Many times in my life, I could say, I can get through this. It's not the tent. So I'm really doing it for my children, which is a very selfish, nothing to do with climate change. But it just so happens that I believe that it's also the solution, and that everybody, no matter where they are, like this friend who came and helped us plant all these things, he's doing it in his little apartment. He's got this tiny little balcony. I mean, you can do it in a couple of single flower pots to just learn about the beauty and the power of the creation of life, a seed germinating and springing up from the soil, right? And that's where food comes from. So, no matter how impoverished somebody is, poverty begins in here. Richard Frankel, Man's Search for Meaning. Did you ever read that book?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Even in a concentration camp, some people were like the lotus flower and developing personally in their thinking and their action, and it actually helped some people to survive in certain ways, whereas others succumbed to the environment around them. And I'm not saying that, you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. No, whether you live or die, it's working on yourself that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And ultimately, on a religious perspective, ultimately, if we all die from climate change, I have that other capacity, which doesn't mean I trivialize this life. I invest in this life. This life, I elevate this life to a supreme spiritual importance, but ultimately this life is nothing. Except a training ground, a proving ground, a learning ground, a growing and developing. We will shed our skin like the snake.
So you have to think of it like a bad science fiction film in 150. Well, it's kind of weird because I gotta give an example that's going to transcend space and time a little bit. So 150 years, the Earth is like completely uninhabitable, and the human species it's the next extinction, as some people fear. Right? Okay. Very, very alarmist. But let's say that is the unfolding of what will happen or does happen. Okay. And I know now the climate change folk are going to say something like, we can't mobilize the religious groups because they're stuck in a fantasy land that there's another sort of like another world, and so they won't do anything. They don't care. They won't change anything because their allegiance is to some other life. And that's like mind-boggling to me. That
But it's also again, it's a false dichotomy and it's a caricature, because guess what? Like all the non-religious folk are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Come on.
Non-religious. Oh no. Well, I had you at the false dichotomy. You're really good at that, at pointing those out. But
You follow me? In other words,
because then you're saying, I see. You're saying, because you're saying the people that are saying that really aren't living up to the deeds that they're doing. So,
well,
but
some people are saying
does,
that,
who does lead up to that? Like the Jesus parable,
right.
It's like you judge yourself first before you judge other people.
Absolutely, but the defining characteristic about meaningful contribution to the issue of climate change is not whether one has religious beliefs or not.
No, but the climate change group are saying it's like you have it. So their religious groups have huge amounts of power and influence on their congregations, right? They can,
and some of them are the biggest climate Nazis.
Climate Nazis,
right? The ones who are trying to coerce and force everybody else to do it their way, right?
Right.
Some religionists are the most vocal advocates, right?
Right.
So again, religion isn't remotely the defining characteristic about making a positive or a negative contribution to climate change in any aspect, whether it's discussion, thought, or action.
You know what? I want to lighten the conversation a little bit, right? So how would you compare the Bahai faith to the Ayn Rand libertarian movement?
I'll let Jafar answer that. That's over my pay grade, just in terms of what the Bahai faith really thinks or believes on that. Jafar was born and raised in the Bahai faith. I'm a Johnny-come-lately fringer.
But you still made it to be a pastor or a...
Not in the Bahai faith.
Oh, not in the Bahai faith.
No, there is no clergy in the Bahai faith.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
I was elected to a local spiritual assembly, but that's most Baha'is have had that experience. I would think. I don't know.
Okay, Jafar, you're on. Libertarian, what's the comparison between coercion? That's what I think that's the thing
before we put Jafar on the spot, let me say there's a huge distinction between what the Bahai faith actually teaches and what the average Baha'i actually does or believes, as there is in most religions. But because there's no clergy in the Baha'i faith, there's probably greater diversity and also divergence of thought. You follow me? Because there's not, an entity or an institution that, drives that conformity.
There's going to be a balance, but Baha'is believe you should be obedient to your government, and that Baha'is believe in a balance between sort of Western liberalism and say Eastern conservatism, like religiously. So I wouldn't say that they're strictly. It's up to the individual, right? And it's up to the individual and the community to kind of come up with their solution, and individually it's between the person and God, and collectively it's a religion that is going to make collective decisions through this democratic process that the Baha'is have.
And you must support the majority decision, which I think is not. I don't know to what degree that is the opposite of Ayn Randian philosophy.
Yeah, it's not. I wouldn't say it's close to Rand at all. However, things like civil liberties, I think are in the scripture, but it's you're taught to take care of the community and look out for the social good of those people around you. But it's a moral obligation. There's no laws saying that you have to do certain things,
right?
And you're left to your instruction to be obedient to your government. So if the government says, take a vaccine or move out of the cities, then you're not supposed to fight the government. You're supposed to be obedient and honorably obedient to the government. But it does warn against the excesses of Western liberal society, and that's.
But it also warns against communism.
Yeah, and it warns against. So there's a balance.
The excesses of Western liberal or libertarian? Both,
because it's coming. It's coming out of.
It warns against materialism.
It's materialism,
Oh, okay,
but
yeah.
it's coming out of Eastern. The Baha'i faith came out of Iran, and we have there's things that happen here in the States that it would be awkward for people in the East, right? And so Americans are very outspoken, and they like to assert their. See, I'm arguing sort of against what my personal sentiment is, but like they like to challenge authority, basically. I think that's pretty. There's this idea of challenging authority, sort of almost arbitrarily, right? And that may be what I was slightly getting at between you and Wade, where you might see that Wade is just challenging the authority of scientists sort of arbitrarily, just because he doesn't have to follow the rules that everybody else is following because he's got his different beliefs, right? So, I mean, that may be confusing things, but just the idea of challenging authority arbitrarily isn't really promoted in the Baha'i faith, which is interesting. But at the same time, there's the importance of freedom of speech and and other civil libertary liberties is that they are there. It's just there's nuance to it, and like Wade said, we're supposed to be obedient to government, and we're supposed to follow the decisions of the group as if they're correct, even if they're wrong, and then they will be sorted out as we go. It's like up to the community and the individuals to figure out what the best is. And so I think this gets back to my point. One thing I want to say is that the most important thing is that we view each individual and community views themselves as the part of the whole, so that we see ourselves as we have to work together to solve the problem. We're not factions. We can't factionalize. If we factionalize, then that becomes the biggest problem, right? And I think that's what Wade is getting at. Like, if we're balkanized or factionalized, then forget all the issues. We're not going to be able to solve any of them, and that becomes the biggest problem, which sort of goes back to what you're saying about nuclear war, right? I mean, that's ultimately, if we're factionalized and aggressive and contentious nationally or by state, then that's the biggest problem, even if global warming is the second biggest problem. Yeah. So unity, that's why, so Baha'is talk about unity a lot, and Baha'u'llah says that unity, there's no power greater than unity. So if we want to solve anything, the number one thing for a Baha'i is to create unity, and I think the number one unity is unity of identity, so that we don't become contentious, because once we start arguing, we can't solve problems. And I don't think, Daniel, I think that it's good. I think that in some ways I see you as kind of a division of labor. Like, you have your interest, you want to work on climate change, and I think that's fine as long as we don't view each other politically as separate and antagonistic. Then we can work together and do our things. But that's what happens. It becomes like, if I say, well, I'm not sure about climate change, or I'm not sure about this, then immediately, or someone else says something that differs from my opinion, then immediately I'm like, okay, that person's against the world and all that is good, so therefore I have to convince them that my way is right, and that just doesn't.
Yeah, but there's an interesting thing that happens that, as a matter of public awareness, like it's you have to take ideas out into the public, and if you think it's a really good idea, you have to put it out in the public and gain momentum on it, right? I mean,
so the way the Baha'i faith approaches that is absolutely 100%, but you then must detach yourself so that it is not your idea. You present your idea, and it becomes the collective property of the community. The community needs to address your idea, but you cannot be attached to your idea and insist and force your idea upon anybody.
Yeah, you guys get stuck on this forcing stuff, and I get that. I mean, don't force anything on anybody ever. So it's like, okay.
Well, so actually, no. Part of me is this is not, well, okay, never mind. I was going to go off on a tangent and an instance that isn't important. Go ahead.
Jafar brought up the perfect thing. He says, the community, it emerges, and the state says, the community basically says, the polis basically says that, we need to take vaccines and we need to do this, we need to do that. So generally speaking, or well, from a Bahai standpoint, we're going to do what the community says. And
well, just to clarify for any listeners, the highest body of the Baha'i faith has said that vaccinations are a decision between the individual and their doctor.
Oh.
But also, additionally, and also elsewhere, doctors that are trusted by the individual, right? So it's very nuanced.
Well, but there again, it wasn't, I don't think the state, that's really weird. Did the state enforce vaccines? No, nobody coerced, but there was other kinds
There's
of
a lot of
coercion
coercion
going on.
There's
right?
a lot
Yeah.
of coercion, right?
And that's probably
the
the
state
point.
has, in fact, many people in America have been fired. People in Canada. I have a brother-in-law, not brother-in-law, my niece and her husband in Canada were both threatened with being fired. One of them, I think, actually lost their job over the vaccination issue. They're not Baha'is, by the way, but anyway, so there's coercion. There is coercion, but not at gunpoint, but losing your livelihood, being fired from your job, that's coercion.
Normative culture is coercive in a way,
Absolutely.
right? I mean,
absolutely.
Would the Baha'is look at it as like a normal upbringing, or like something natural that, I mean, there's natural coercive norms that happen.
Well, this is what we talked about very early in the show. So we've come full circle, and we've now gone on for 2 hours. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the live broadcast, and we can continue, right? So next week, first of all, if there's anyone still viewing, and it looks like there are a few, go ahead, like, subscribe, be back next week. We'll pick it up with Patagonia and the other example that you're going to find from Dr. Keen's research, Daniel, hopefully to get into some of that. We're going to continue off the record, just hashing into this a little bit more, but we've gone a good 2 hours. We're really appreciative of our viewers, the comments that we had, and we look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place.